Hi there, it's Marlene Chism, and I am excited to share with you difficult conversations, 10 common mistakes to avoid. I've never known a manager or a leader say, I really enjoy the part of my job that includes having difficult conversations, especially about behavior and poor performance. In fact, new supervisors often don't realize that part of their job is going to be talking about things that are difficult. They don't realize that. And so as a result, they become very friendly. They try to be best friends or they try to be the hero. They cover for people. They make all kinds of mistakes because they don't realize this difficult part of the job that none of us get much training on. And so I'm going to share my intention for today. My intention for today is to do a brief history of how I got from where I am now to where I was and how this came about. We'll talk about the 10 common mistakes and what to do instead. And then I'm going to introduce to you something that I've created that is the problem solver for these mistakes. I call it the performance coaching model. I'll be sharing a little bit along the way, and at the end, I will give you more information about the performance coaching model. So, a little bit about me. My name is Marlene Chism. I'm an author. I have 4 different commercially published books, the first of which was Stop Workplace Drama, published by Wiley in 2010. And believe it or not, I still get calls because people have that book. And so that was my first book. My second book was No Drama Leadership, How Enlightened Leaders Transform Culture in the Workplace. My third book was 7 Ways to Stop Drama in Your Healthcare Practice. And then my fourth book was From Conflict to Courage, How to Stop Avoiding and Start Leading. That book has received a couple of awards. It was longlisted for an international award on learning impact in 2022. And then just last year, it was nominated for an award from the big New York Book Awards. And so that's been very exciting for me. So let's do a little bit about the history. In 2018, I had a particular observation, and it had been through years of research, years of working with different kinds of organizations. And the observation was that every big problem in an organization could be traced back to a conversation that should have happened, but didn't. I want to let that land for a moment because when you think about big problems, maybe one that you're having right now, you might be saying to yourself, I told them about the problem, especially if you're trying to manage upward. I told them, and they said, I'll get back to you, or they said, we'll deal with it later. I told them that nothing happened. That means a conversation did not happen. So a lot of times we say, I told them, or I've mentioned it a few times, but it wasn't really a conversation. It was avoiding, it was appeasing. And so a conversation never happened. And I'm pretty sure that you will never watch a news story again about a big problem in a corporation without understanding and without looking at the fact that every big problem can be traced back to a conversation that should have happened, but did not. So that led to my next book, which was From Conflict to Courage. And when I was positioning for this book, it was in 2020 or 2021 when we were going through the pandemic. And I had this idea that I might want to write a book about difficult conversations. Well, long story short, the publisher said, we already have someone working on a title like that. Could you write something bigger and write something about conflict? And I jumped on that chance because I know that you teach what you need to learn. And I knew that in me thinking deeply about conflict and as it relates to what I've already done in difficult conversations and improving communication and relationships, I knew that that would be my life's work from then on. And so as you see on the book, there's 2 arrows, one going upward and one going downward. When I first started doing this work, I created a definition for conflict that would actually be useful. And so you see 2 arrows. The idea is that when relationships are not working, when we have what we call conflict, it's really just opposing drives, desires, and demands. So if you think of conflict as opposing drives, desires, and demands, it makes you curious. You then want to understand, what are their drives? What are their desires? Where are we different? Because if you can understand that, then you'll be better at dealing with the conflict, with finding the common ground. So what happened was I put the difficult conversations piece on the inside of chapter 7. And that came from my work with another organization where we had massaged and worked on this leadership development on their course, training their leaders, training their owners, their business owners. And so that culminated in the chapter of this book. It didn't make itself into its own book, but it became part of a different book. So that was how that happened. And then in 2025, I built the performance coaching model, and that's a digital course. How that came about was because of my work with LinkedIn Learning, I wanted to transfer that skill into something of just my own course that was a progressive course, because LinkedIn typically doesn't want your course material to be progressive. Each video typically has to stand alone, so you can't really teach a framework or a model. And so I was off to have knee surgery and had to have a knee replacement, been doing a lot of dancing and even dancing on concrete, and worked on concrete for 21 years. And that resulted in me needing some knee replacements. So I had a knee replacement in 2025. And during that downtime, I found the people to put this together. I produced the performance coaching model, an online course. It's the hardest thing I've ever done. It's harder than writing a book. And it's much harder than making a LinkedIn course because I didn't have all the people helping me that I didn't realize how much value there is in all the people and their expertise. So that's how this came about and where we are today. So I'm going to get started right away with the 10 common mistakes leaders make when having difficult conversations. And I love this picture because it's of this leader who's a lion, just roaring, and these two sheep that are nervous and scared. And what I have learned by watching and observing and researching over the last 25 years is that all of us leaders have coping mechanisms. We either get real aggressive or we avoid, but we do the best we can. And our dysfunctional behaviors really is to soothe our nervous system, and simply because we haven't had the training and we haven't rewired our brain to really lead. And so this is what I think of when I think of dysfunctional conversations that leaders are having. So I want to talk about the very first two mistakes that I see with difficult conversations. And the first one is just winging it. We wing it because we don't know what to say, we don't know how to say it, and we tell a story. We try to be their best friend. We tell them how great they are. How was your weekend? And we try to slip in something about the performance or behavior in the conversation. And we say things like, well, we're all adults. We should be able to deal with this, that it'll get better. And I had the conversation. I think they understood, but we're really just winging it. Therefore, we're very inconsistent. The number two mistake we make is we have the inability to articulate the situation. I discovered this back in 2012. So I've discovered these parts and pieces over time, and it's culminated in this understanding and in this proven framework. I was working with a family-owned medium enterprise type of company. And we had done some workshops for a part of the leadership team. And then I was working directly with the 3 top leaders. And I am going to share the reality that there's times that I have made so many mistakes in my consulting, as we're all making mistakes in our leadership journey. But what I learned was, with talking with the 3 C-suite, one in particular, the COO, we were having a conversation on the phone, and he said, well, I've got a direct report that's really pretty useless. And I was curious. I said, well, what do you mean? He said, he's just not engaged. He doesn't really belong here. He's not really good for our company. And I said, well, what is he doing that he shouldn't be doing? And he said, well, that's really hard to say. And I said, well, what's he not doing that he should be? He said, again, you're making this difficult. You can tell when someone doesn't get it, when they don't want to. He's just sloughing off. And he said, and I kind of inherited him anyway. He was here before we bought the company. And I said, well, how long have you had him working with you? And he said, 12 years. And so what I heard was a lot of assumptions, a lot of blaming, a lot of they don't do a good job, they're not any good, but he couldn't really articulate the situation. So those are the first two. And so here's the result of that. The first one is what I call the 3 A's. And in my book, I talk about appeasing, avoiding, and aggression. So let's look at avoiding first. Managers and leaders that are pretty aware, they kind of know they avoid. They'll admit it. They're self-aware. They know they avoid. They'll say, I don't like conflict and I avoid it as much as I can until I just can't wait any longer. So they know they avoid. They just don't know what to do about it. The people that are aggressive sometimes think that's the way to be. They have an authoritarian outlook and they're like, my way or the highway, and I'm the boss. So they get aggressive. Or some leaders that are unaware that they're aggressive, they just say, well, it's my way or the highway, or I am the leader, so I have to be aggressive. Or they don't have the skills, they don't have the capacity, so they get aggressive. And so the ones that really I think is the worst pattern is the appeasers, because they just view themselves as a nice leader. And so when people appease, it's because they're trying to be the best friend. They want to be seen as collaborative. And so they say things like, yes, that's a wonderful idea, or I'll get back with you, or I agree with you, and they don't. So avoiding, appeasing, and aggression, those are the three results that I see from ineffective conversations, and those are just coping patterns. And then also wasting money, thousands of dollars on coaching and workshops for the wrong person. One of the things that happens a lot to me is someone will call and they'll say, we've got a lot of team drama and we've got a plan, we're going to have a workshop and we'd like for you to do a workshop, and we've got a coaching for someone, and then we have a 360 we might like to do for someone. But when I investigate further and I find out it's really only one or two people, and the real root problem is the leader that I'm talking to does not know how to have the conversations, and they're trying to build a plan so that everything works out. And I'll admit, building a plan feels good, but I always say a plan is a guide, not a god. And if you don't have real expertise, that plan is just making you feel comfortable, like something's going to change when it's really not. So what that contributes to is a lack of leadership confidence. And then finally, it creates dysfunctional teams, because when the other team members know that there's one or two people that are the problem child, so to speak, they get resentful, and then you start getting absenteeism, you get blame, you get game playing, you get verbal ping pong, you get this dysfunction that happens, and you lose your really, really good people. What this is, these problems, the root cause is structural. What I mean by that is there's no planning, there's no foundation, and there's no shared framework. So if we as a leadership team do not know how to plan for conversations, we don't have the foundational skills, and there's no framework, all of the conversations across the leadership team are going to be they're going to be different. They're not going to be consistent. So what I have offered in my performance coaching model, and you can see I've changed my logo since then, but this is the form, and it is called the Leadership Clarity Tool. It is a method for planning for difficult conversations. And I asked this question. So do you think that every single busy leader is going to pull out this form and fill this out when they need to have a conversation? Absolutely not. But here's what I can tell you. If you use the tool the first 2 or 3 times you have a difficult conversation, it will change the way you think, and you'll never need it again. It's asking such questions as what's happening that should not be happening, what's not happening that should be, and it's asking how does it affect the business? Have I talked to these people? What behavior needs to change? It asks the important questions that you need before you get into a conversation. That's why people have conversations where they're winging it and they're making assumptions, because they don't know how to plan for the conversation. The information is not in front of them. What's in front of them are their emotions, and that's exactly why. So this is the first tool for the foundation, is to plan for that conversation. So now I want to talk about the next 4 mistakes. The next mistake is leaders don't know where or how to start. So they might start with, how was your weekend? Or what's going on for you? Or we need to talk. Those ways of starting a conversation are ineffective for so many reasons. And what happens is we have what we call the S sandwich approach. This is what I see the most common, and consultants talk about this a lot. So the S sandwich is, I compliment you at the beginning of the conversation. I say, we need to talk. I compliment you, tell you how great you are. Then I tell you about a problem that you need to fix, and then I compliment you again. And I feel really good because I didn't hurt your feelings and we had a conversation, but you're not completely clear on what needs to happen. So that's the problem with the S sandwich approach. Another big problem I see is that leaders tend to want to write things out. It's fine to do that in your planning, but for difficult conversations, it has to be face to face, video to video, or at least by phone. I prefer face to face or video because it's really not good if you're emailing and sending letters. And so I see a lot of that happening. And what we need to realize is that digital communications can be forwarded. You can screenshot, you can alter the message. People can play games. It's not good. It turns into long threads of back and forth, he said, she said, and sharing, and it freaks people out. It's not a good use of communication. And then the final one that you can see is moving the chess pieces around. In other words, a reorg. So there's two people that are causing problem. They're the collaborators with each other. The other people are struggling with these two, and we've got team drama. So we're going to reorganize. And what that means is we're going to send these two to a different hallway or to the basement, and we're going to call it something else. We're going to say it's a reorganization and everybody ought to be happy. And it's not very transparent. And the truth is they know what you're doing. So you can call it whatever you want to, and you can put a beautiful bow on it, but people know what you're doing, and it's not a great method. I'm going to give you an example here that shows all three. Let me back up just a second. Okay, and this visual is covering this just a bit, so I'll have to kind of read through it. But your contributions, this is the visual, your contributions have been instrumental to our department. As our needs have evolved, we need to realign our resources to meet the broader organizational demands, and effective on X date, your role will transition to the main office under the direction of this person at this location, and you will assume additional system administration responsibilities. Do you think that that is a letter about what you're doing wrong, what your behavior or your performance? Let me tell you the background story. This was a situation where it's a tech company, but the person that got the letter was a tech person. And what were they doing or not doing? They were not taking initiative. They were hiding out in their office, playing video games, and not acting like the consultant they needed to be. They weren't taking the initiative. They were waiting to be told what to do. Here's the kicker. This person's great at the technical aspects, has a lot of a depth of knowledge, but they needed to be guided like someone on a leash, like taking a dog to the dog park. And so they didn't do their job effectively because they were kind of lazy in their approach, always shoving the work off to someone else, or saying, well, I told this department about it. They didn't continue to complete what needed to be completed. Now, here's the issue here. So this person is not performing, but they get this kind of a letter, a physical letter. And the real issue is their boss didn't know how to correct their behavior. Every time the upper level human resources person told them to have this conversation, they called in sick. So the human resources individual wrote the letter and gave it to the problem employee. So that's an example of ineffective communication. It's clipping the bloom on a field full of dandelions. The next problem, the next mistake is assuming, interpreting, and imagining. We human beings are meaning-making machines. And when we don't know what's going on and we don't have a method to get out of our monkey mind, what we do is we say, they don't care, they did that on purpose, they're undermining me. And that's how we see it, because we're assuming. And that's how we start laying foundation for a terrible conversation, because we're already resentful. The next problem, the next mistake that we make is a problem orientation versus an outcome orientation. The problem becomes so big that that's all we focus on. The problem. In my body of work, I call that my shark, but you don't understand my shark because I use what I call the language of the island, which you'll see here in a minute. When we focus on the problem becomes even bigger. So there's an example of some of the Microsoft clip art that I use when I talk about the island and the boat and the shark. So the boat is point A, that's the situation. The island is the outcome, and the shark is the obstacle. And so when we're using that visual, it gives us a clear understanding of what's going on in almost any conversation. So as I said, there is the situation, the outcome, and the obstacle. And when we focus on the obstacle, the problem just gets bigger and we lose our way. And what we do is we start focusing backwards on what happened, what you did in the past. And I call that, focusing on the past or focusing on the pirate instead of focusing on where we're going. We're focused on what you did wrong versus what you need to improve upon. And when you change your language, to change the culture, you have to change the conversation. So I love learning to use language to shape your leadership and shape your culture. The next mistake that we can see on this list, number 6, is failure to connect the dots. How does this issue affect the business? I can tell you that most beginning or like promoted leaders, frontline leaders, supervisors, they really don't even know how someone's behavior or performance is affecting the business. They know how it affects them. It affects their workflow, it affects their life, and it becomes very personal. What they often don't see is how it affects patient safety, customer service, revenue. They don't understand the bigger picture of why the problem is so important to address. It is not really personal. It's actually professional. It's actually about the business. So when you start connecting those dots, it's actually a different conversation. And here's a fun little visual. This is a cartoon that I made based on a conversation I had with someone who wanted to let someone go who was not performing and had not been performing for a good 2 or 3 years. But the CEO wouldn't back her up. And he said, there's nothing I can really do. They've been so loyal to the organization. And I know we've all worked in corporations and organizations and government entities where there's someone that's been skating by, they slough off, but they've been there 20 years, 25 years. There's 1 year left for retirement. And I appreciate that grace. But what really happened was many conversations many years ago did not happen. They were given good performance evaluations, and now there's not much you can do without a lawsuit. So there's nothing I can do. They've been so loyal to the organization. So what's the point? I asked this question, what's the point? Because with one entrepreneurial company that I was working with where there were a lot of owners, someone brought up the fact that they had a really high performer, a rainmaker. And this rainmaker, they could not afford to lose. They said, why can't everybody just work around them? That's just how it is. They're bringing in the rain. The other people are support people. Well, you can make the case that there's going to be turnover. The money they're making is going to be used to hire new people. You could make the case that maybe you don't need to deal with it because it's worth it to make that money and fast growth. But the real point is that if you're building something long-term, it's going to affect your culture. So if you don't see it that way, then there's not enough motivation to have conversations, especially when someone's a great performer. They know everything. They know the logistics. They got the technical experience, or they bring in the money. So you have to look at this bigger picture and start steering that ship 3 degrees till you get it back on course. I always say the one with clarity navigates the ship and everyone else shovels coal. So if you're shoveling coal, it means someone else is navigating and that they're putting things in their frame instead of where it needs to be. So the root cause I used to think was a lack of courage. In fact, the name of my book, From Conflict to Courage. What I now know is that clarity comes before courage, because no one is going to have courage when they already know that they're not clear and that they're not certain what they're trying to achieve. And they already have information that shows that that person is going to be difficult to deal with. So there's not enough clarity. And so it's not as much about courage in the beginning as it is about leadership clarity. So I'm going to show you how this works with the model that I've created. We've talked about these problems of don't know where to start, assuming and pretending, a problem orientation, and failure to connect the dots. In the performance coaching model, these issues are solved with these 4 skills: setting the intention, naming the observed behavior, speaking to the vision, and stating the business case. So each one of those videos will teach that in succession of the conversation. And so we set the intention, for example, if we're looking at just a problem and we say, well, Kim interrupts everyone at these company meetings. So it's affecting the team. We don't say, my intention, Kim, is to talk to you about why you're interrupting so much. We say, Kim, I'd like to talk with you to discuss how we can improve our team meetings. Next, you're going to name that observed behavior. So we're teaching that inside the course. So let's look at the mistakes so far. The first two are foundational. As I said, winging it, which contributes to a lack of confidence, and the inability to articulate the situation. Well, we solved that with the foundational tools. The next four tools are that you don't know. The next four tools have to do with leadership clarity. That solves the problem of not knowing where to start, assuming and interpreting, problem orientation versus outcome orientation, and failure to connect the dots. So now let's look at the next three mistakes. The next one is telling versus coaching. I've told them, I'm telling you, you've got to improve. You've got to have a conversation. And as they say it in ATD, telling ain't training. And so telling is not the same as teaching or coaching. I can tell someone to have a conversation, just like the example I shared with you in the physical letter that was sent by HR. You can say, go have a conversation, go have a conversation. But if the director or the leader or the manager does not know how, they won't do it. And if they do, it won't be effective. So telling versus coaching, because we say things like, well, I told him 1,000 times. That's not teaching. That's not training. That's not coaching. Improve your performance. What does that mean? It's not specific. Be nicer. Stop making the same mistake. Communicate differently. Have that conversation. Address the issue now. Those are the things we do when we're just telling or not training or coaching. I want to share some research from Talent Strategy. Coaching conversations are not happening. Managers don't have the skills. As a result, employees don't get coaching necessary to achieve expected results. And most managers feel uncomfortable with behavior and performance coaching. It's only because they don't have the skills. That's why they don't have the skills. The next problem is a checklist mentality. I see this a lot, and I know that if you're like me, you love to check the list because there's a dopamine hit. You feel like you're getting stuff done. But the checklist mentality is hurting our leadership. We have a checklist mentality because we have a workshop and we have coaching and we do things and we have deliverables, but we don't connect the dots. So we're checking boxes and we're saying things like you need to document, because if you don't document, there's going to be litigation. There'll be a lawsuit. You need to document correctly. But what I say is document for what purpose? Why? To avoid a lawsuit? Document to prove that you tried? Document so that you can eventually fire? What I see the most, to be honest with you, is I see people documenting for the purpose of legitimately being able to let someone go. But the documentation should be for the purpose of looking at patterns, coaching, observing behaviors, and seeing if there's a change, and documenting the accountability of the said performance goals. But what happens is if you document, you can document all day long and still have a big problem. There's something I've been following for many years. In fact, when I was writing and authoring From Conflict to Courage, I paid attention to this and I've been watching it ever since. Finally came to fruition where SHRM, the very organization that teaches us how to document, how to be human resource people. The Society for Human Resource Management, they got charged with an $11.5 million verdict. Now, I'm sure they'll go to appeal, but I've been watching this for a while, and I'm going to just share the gist of what was going on here. There was an employee from Egypt, a woman of color, that had a manager, and the manager gave her great reviews. There was not any real documentation. If there was, it was good. She got good reviews. She had no problems. That manager left and another manager took her place. And then this new manager did not give the same good performance reviews. She found flaws. And so it looked like she was discriminating to the person in question. And she could have been. But let's look at some other possibilities that we haven't explored. Is there a possibility that there should have been some conversations before with the first manager who knew there were some performance issues, but she wanted to rock the boat. She was only going to stay a few more years or a few more months. or she knew that this person was maybe a little hard to get along with. I'm making all this up to make a point that there's many factors in this, but what happened was because that one manager had a great relationship or not, or just didn't have a conversation, when a new manager came in, it looked like she was being picked on. And maybe at some point she was being picked on because the relationship became bad. I don't know the details, but I know what the patterns are and I know what I've seen. And what I know is that if you don't train every manager to have the same consistent way of evaluating performance, then you're up for discrepancy. And so I could say, well, I'm a woman and I'm older, so I'm being discriminated against, when in reality, I wasn't corrected so that I could get my performance up to par. We all have areas where we could say we're not being treated fairly, but I'm not about preventing lawsuits. Like, that's not my goal. My goal is always to say, let's build transparent relationships where conversations are happening. And the goal behind my documentation, my conversation, is to get you to where you need to go. And for me to be your cheerleader and your supporter and your accountability partner, because that changes the conversation totally. So I don't really know the details. I wasn't there. I'm giving you ways to think about something critically when it looks like the waters are getting muddy with being blamed for not being fair. Let's look at the practices. Let's look at the training. And so the next mistake that I want to talk about is getting distracted in the conversation. A lot of reasons that some managers won't have conversations is they are afraid of getting trapped in a he said, she said, not fair. Look what they did. Look what happened last year. And they don't know where to go and they don't know how to plan for those distractions. And here's what it looks like using my language of the island. We see that both the current situation, the desired result, we're going to have this conversation, but then we get a distraction and they go to the island called, but that's not fair. Or they go to the island called, you should hear what everybody else thinks about your leadership. It's not just me. If you take that bait, it's like you're the carp, they are the fishermen, and you go to that island called, let's talk about my lack of leadership ability, and you start getting into that conversation, they have guided you off course. So you have to understand how to prepare for these distractions, because it's natural that people would look for a way to get out of a conversation when they feel threatened. And the root cause of this is employee confusion, lack of employee clarity. When employees are not clear about where the conversation's going, they do what they can to protect themselves. And here's the research. The brain is wired for defensiveness. I've been called defensive before when someone argues with me and I know that I'm right. What? That's not true. That's what we do as human beings. We have to rewire ourselves to take the breath and to get curious. So when you say to someone like an employee that has a behavioral or performance issue, and you say, we need to talk, it makes them want to protect themselves. But if you know how to set a really clear direction before the meeting, one that puts them at ease, and it's positive, it's directed toward an end result, and they feel that you want to coach them, it just is a lot easier. And so here's what it looks like from the problem to the model that I teach. So telling instead of coaching or teaching, a checklist mentality, and getting distracted in the conversation. So skill number 5 is cultivate curiosity. When you start getting curious about what makes them tick, it's sort of like you're turning this combination lock. You're not assuming that you have the answer. You're opening the conversation, curiosity. You've done the planning. You've said the first part of the conversation. You're cultivating your own curiosity so that you can then think like a consultant as you hear them talk. What I will tell you is that in every piece of drama, there's always a lack of clarity. So clarity is always going to be a part of it. That could be that you've changed priorities and didn't communicate that. So lack of clarity. It may be that the way their former manager talked with them about projects was different than how you do. So there may be a little lack of clarity. You can find that piece. But what you want to avoid doing is thinking that it's a lack of willingness, because that's the place most of us go. We think they didn't want to, they're not doing it, they're being obstinate. What you want to do is say there's always a lack of clarity. We're going to leave willingness at the back door for now. We're going to say, is it skill, priority, or resources? And if you start to find what that combination lock is, you can figure out what's at the root of the problem and you can fix it. And then, of course, you're going to do that through some radical listening. And what that means is Let me go back again. The radical listening, what that means is that you are not going to butt in, advise, talk about your own story. You're going to listen in such a way that you're really listening for skill, priority, resources, willingness, and you're just going to like train yourself to be patient and present in the moment. And then the real fun skill for this is testing for resistance. And I teach a magic phrase. When you test for resistance, you have to realize that there's 3 levels of resistance. And those 3 levels of resistance is your resistance, and you can know when you're resistant. Oh, I'm wanting to avoid their resistance. They're going to say, I've already done this. I've already tried. And then there's your resistance to their resistance. So when I'm coaching a leader and they say, I'm not going to have the conversation, I already know what they're going to say. Then I ask, are you willing to have the conversation anyway? Because they are resisting the other person's resistance and using that as the excuse. Even though you know what they're going to say, you still have the obligation to have the conversation. And that's where we all get trapped. So I want to share the final number 10 mistake. The number 10 mistake is using accountability as punishment. And accountability kind of has a bad rap. And here's a visual that I use. I'll explain a little bit of that in a minute, but it's 4 quadrants. And what you can see is that on the vertical, I'm talking about high responsibility. And on the horizontal, I'm talking about high accountability. When we have low responsibility and we're using accountability as compliance or as punishment, you get people skewing the numbers or doing what they need to do just so that it passes. And I've been in those work situations before, and believe me, employees can find a way around really taking responsibility for it. They'll get the accountability, but it's mainly compliance. And so what you want to do is build an accountable culture. And so I'm going to share some research from Cultural Partners, a sample of 40,000 participants. I think that's a really healthy sample. They said that accountability is incorrectly perceived as strictly consequential and almost entirely after the fact. Of those surveyed, 80% say feedback happens only when things go wrong or not at all. So look at that information about accountability. And what I've learned is that it's in the way we define it. And if we don't have a solid definition for accountability, we use it intermixed with the word responsibility, and they are 2 separate ideas. I'm going to share that in a minute. They also said when it comes to holding others accountable, now think about that, holding others accountable. That means that with accountability, there's a witness, there's a coach, there's a teacher, there's someone taking note. When it comes to holding others accountable, 82% of survey participants say they try but fail, or they just avoid it altogether because they don't understand it. Most of us don't really have a real understanding of it. So what I've done in the performance coaching model is really gone into depth in making the distinction between head and heart. Accountability is of the head, it's measurement, it's numbers. And responsibilities of the heart, it's ownership. I own this. And what I know about this is that when you really own something, you want the feedback. You want the coach. You want to know how to get better. You want to grow. An example I can use is that I take ballroom dance lessons. I have a teacher. I get correction every time I go. And it's for my improvement. I don't look at it as I'm a terrible person or I'm never going to be a good dancer. I look at it as a measurement of growth. And I can practice on my own and I can think that I'm doing better. And that is certainly responsibility. And I can even lie to myself and say, it's great. I can compete now. But the real truth comes when someone with more expertise or someone that's not me is measuring my performance. And so what we want to create is quadrant 2, where we have high responsibility and high accountability. So depending on where you are in these quadrants, it tells you where you need to elevate. And that really, it needs more discussion, but I wanted you to see this snapshot because I think it's really helpful for most leaders to understand the distinctions and the way we use language around responsibility versus accountability. And here's how that works on the performance coaching model. It's seeing accountability as punitive is the mistake. What we're going to do instead, though, is we're going to get the agreement that we're going to be accountable right up front. And with any conversation that's really important, we're going to have a next step and a follow-up. So we've got the agreement, we've got a next step, we've got the follow-up so that we can just check in and we can say, did we grow? Did we improve? And then we can document that coaching worked, that it changed. What happens, though, is this. When we finally have the conversation, we feel so, so good about it. We feel great about the conversation and they feel good. We shake hands, we might hug, there may be tears, and you're like, oh, that was so stressful. Thank God we've had this conversation. And then in 3 weeks, the problem starts creeping in again. What happened was you felt good in the moment. There was a warm glow. The stress was relieved, and now the problem is back. The problem won't come back if you already have an accountability meeting scheduled in advance. So I'm giving that away right now. Okay. So here's what we've talked about. We've talked about difficult conversations, 10 mistakes to avoid, which is winging it, lack of confidence, inability to articulate the situation, not knowing where to start, assuming and interpreting, a problem orientation versus outcome orientation, a failure to connect the dots, telling versus coaching, checklist mentality, getting distracted in conversations, and using accountability as punishment. The performance coaching model is a proven framework with practice script, 9 universal skills, 17 short videos. And this is a look of what it looks like on the inside. It's hosted on a platform called Kajabi. On the left, you'll see there's all of the videos, the sections, the modules of welcome, the foundation, leadership clarity, employee clarity. And you'll see on the right are the essential tools, which are the learning guides and the script and the framework. So you'll get a script to see what it looks like when it's all said and done. I want to just finally share that Harvard Business Review reports that the old performance reviews are over. They're no longer working. You need to talk to your people more than once a year or twice a year. People don't want to feel blindsided. What really, really works is narrative feedback, which is what I call a conversation. You're talking all the time. You are discussing what's working, what's not working, and you're giving people the feedback and you're documenting the progress. And it's feedback that includes specific behaviors that are linked to performance outcomes. So here's the performance coaching model, and that's what the framework looks like. And you get all the skills, and it's $749, and you can check it out at theperformancecoachingmodel.com. Thank you so much for joining me, and feel free to reach out, schedule a meeting to talk more about how we can do this in your organization, performancecoachingmodel.com.